if we can get people to widespread understand this and adopt these things, I mean, we're potentially talking about substantial increases on turkey productivity across the landscape. Folks out there, I know you've got buddies and friends and family who are thinking this is all about predators. And if you have those people, share this episode with them. Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Gulsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science. Well, I think that we're good to go now, as far as I can tell.
Now I just have to make sure that I abide by the rules of the road while trying to podcast. Don't get pulled over.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'll start the conversation with this. I have said on a number of occasions something along the lines that habitat management is anti-predator management.
Right.
And I don't know if it resonates with people exactly why I would say that. And, I think the thing that most people go to immediately is, if you have better nesting cover or brooding cover, the hen is more able to avoid predation because she has better ways to escape it, right? Or avoid being detected.
Exactly.
And I think that is a relevant part of the discussion, but I wanted to go and dig up some information to show another side of this coin, so to speak. So
right.
I have researched some practices that I promote frequently, and I know that you do as well. Particularly prescribed fire, because there's a lot of information on fire, and most of the information comes from open forest systems, particularly open pine. So you can kind of equate that to you go out and thin and burn like we often recommend for turkeys, right?
Right.
So I went out and have found a few studies. One of them is hot off the press. Was published in 2024, so it's literally just come out. But I wanted to see how did those practices affect the relative abundance or habitat use or whatever by things that will eat turkeys.
Right.
And after I did that, it was a little bit remarkable.
Yeah.
So I'll just start with the paper that's hot off the press because I think it's really cool. So one of my colleagues led a project, Bob McCleary. His student at the time was Wes Boone, who is now a postdoc with Chris Moorman working on turkeys.
Uh-huh.
So small world where, a lot of the people coming up through the ranks are shuffling around between labs, and this is one that's doing that. And I'm sure if it's his intent that he'll soon have his own lab and be one of the ones shuffling it around. But right now, I wanted to focus on his PhD work, or at least part of it, that he's just published. So in this study, there were 5 study areas across essentially the Panhandle and northern Florida, and they had 110 grids of cameras in this study, and almost 4,000 days of sampling, 600,000 plus images, So pretty extensive study. What they wanted to do in this study was look at multiple scales, how the occurrence of fire affected basically all the mammals they were detecting. But of course, for our purposes, we're mainly interested in those mammals that eat turkeys, or at least at one life stage they do.
Right.
So, they basically modeled the occurrence probability as a function of how many times on average an area was burned in a 20-year period. So you think about that for a minute. If it's burned, 5 times in a 20-year period, that's a 4-year return interval, right? If it's 5 times, it's a 4-year return interval, so forth. So it's a little bit, it was, I understand why they did it from the modeling standpoint to be clear for the paper, but I think we should continually, translate that into what it means for us with the application of fire, because we think of fire return interval, right? So we need to.
So you said the average is 4 years.
Say that again.
You said the average is 4 years in your example that you used.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. If it's
so, there may have been some years that it went 5 before fire, and then maybe there were some years that it went 3, and then.
Well, it's actually
long story short, on average, they're burning every 4 across that.
Yeah.
You say it was a 10-year period?
No, 20-year. But yeah, you're pretty close, because they have lots of stands. Not only could or I should say that a different way. They had many grids of cameras, and those cameras were kind of grouped based on their average fire history. So some of them might have had a 4-year return, and they met that exactly. And then other ones might have had variation in the return interval that averaged 4. They would both be the same variable in the model, if that makes sense.
Right. And I would assume that a lot of this, in order to obtain that fire history, was probably conducted on public land, on wildlife management areas or state forests or national forests.
That's
right?
Correct. All 5 of the areas were really large public lands. I think 2 or maybe 3 of them were military bases, and then all 5 are definitely public land. I can't recall what all of them were, but
so
3
I'm
of
just trying
them
to kind of set this. Yeah, so I'm just kind of trying to understand and set the stage to provide context. So I would assume that since these are public sites in Florida, that there's probably not a whole lot of traffic going on. I don't know what the legality of that is on public lands there. But I would definitely presume that there's no feeding.
Yeah, there's definitely no feeding. But the trapping stuff could vary somewhat. But in general, I think all of these are probably open to small game hunting, where some of these things might be harvestable. But it's relatively common. I'd have to go through the individual regulations, and if people want to do that, we're going to link this paper, and you can, they all have a reg book that you can go look at it if you're curious about that. But I did not do that for the purposes here. But I would say that it's very likely that the trapping is a very low presence compared to what it often is on private land.
Yeah, they're definitely not doing like what they did in that rabies study that we covered, where they had a trap for 25 acres and they were intensively trying to reduce the population.
No, and that wasn't that's not even the point of management of any of these places. Like their intent is not to reduce these mammals. In fact, their objective is probably more often to increase biodiversity, which would include these species.
Right.
So I just think it's we're taking something that was done for a different purpose and talking about it as it's relevant to turkeys. So it's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to help folks understand the setting.
Yeah, there's definitely not intense persecution on purpose of these
Right.
these turkey predators. And the paper is titled "Frequent Prescribed Burns Reduce Mammalian Species Richness and Occurrence in Longleaf Pine Sandhills." Their
Well, that's
turkeys
quite a
aren't even. Say it again.
I was going to say, well, that's quite the takeaway.
Well, I didn't want to read.
Well, I
didn't
guess
want to
we're
read.
done.
Yeah, we'll wrap that one up. Yeah, my point is I don't even know that turkeys are mentioned in the paper, but I
Right.
care just like our audience cares about things that eat turkeys because it's relevant to turkeys. So I really wanted to address that statement that I've made some, and I'm sure that you've made something similar, but I wasn't sure. But I just wanted to catalyze this thought, right? So they detected a whole bunch of different things that will eat turkeys at some life stage, including armadillos, feral hogs, gray fox, raccoon, possum. I didn't list any other ones. They may have. Actually, I think that's all of the ones that are relevant to turkeys.
Did you say bobcat?
They didn't have they excluded bobcat and I believe black bears also because they detected them so little they couldn't model it.
They have enough data to work with. Yeah.
Yeah.
Got it.
So there were a couple of relevant species that they would have included, but they just detected them very little.
And I would assume that these camera grids are unbaited, correct?
That's correct. It's just a grid of cameras out in the woods.
Okay.
And they're set up. Each grid is set up so that there is a similar amount of area covered per camera, and like they're arranged the same in each location to standardize that. So anyway, they did it at the point scale, which would be basically detecting one of these species or the probability of detecting one within 25 meters, about 30 yards of the camera. Pretty relevant to a nest, right? So this is kind of a good view of how likely something would be to encounter a hen on a nest or a nest that the hen is recessed from or whatever. So at that scale, there were two predators of interest that that were detected fairly commonly, and that was the gray fox and armadillo. And with both of these, well, we'll just start with gray fox. With gray fox, when you're on the zero burn part of the scale, so in other words, the stands that they were sampling had no burns on average in a 20-year period. The probability of detecting gray fox is about 70% at that point scale.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's pretty high, and I think it's important here to make the point because a lot of people don't think about gray fox as being a significant turkey predator, but I can remember with our simulated nest study in the Talladega National Forest in Alabama, we found that gray fox were actually, I can't remember exactly where they ranked out, but I think they were right behind raccoons in terms of the number of documented cases of nest predation on the simulated nest in that study. So they can be relevant in some landscapes.
Right. Well, same thing with armadillos. I don't think armadillos are eating the majority of nests anywhere, but they have been documented eating them, and so gray fox. So, I think the point will become clear when we get through all these species. It really doesn't matter which one you're talking about. But so gray fox, 70% detection probability with 0 burns. By the time you get to 4 burns or more per 20 years, so that's a 5-year return interval or more frequent. So that's where it's
that's not asking much.
Yeah, so you're returning fire at least every 5 years on the space. The detection probability at that point scale drops below 10%.
Golly.
So we go from 70 with no burning to 5-year or more frequent interval. We go below 10%. Armadillos at that point scale is a 40% detection probability. And if we do the same thing when we get to 4 or more, so that 5-year return interval or more frequent fire, we go to less than 10%.
Wow.
So at the patch scale, I was able to aggregate these because basically the same pattern applied across the board. At the patch scale, armadillo, feral hog, gray fox, raccoon, possum all go from greater than 70%. So the lowest of those would be a 70% detection probability. Oh, I don't think I said at the patch scale what that meant. Patch scale means 200 meters, so about 250-yard circle. So this is, are we detecting them in that 250-yard radius?
Yeah.
So armadillo, feral hog, gray fox, raccoon, possum, where we have greater than a 70% probability that we're going to detect them in that, that area, that patch.
Right.
That goes to less than 20% across the board by the time you get to 7 fires or more. So if we get to a 3-year fire return interval, we decrease, as compared to not burning, the detection of all those species from greater than 70% to all of them are less than 20%.
Wow.
And if you continue on and go to 10 fires, so a 2-year fire return interval, they're all less than 10% detection probability.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. I'm trying to think of a way to like reframe that or put it into the context of, it's not like we oftentimes we think about predator reduction, we're thinking about reducing abundance, but in this case, we're not reducing abundance across the landscape. We're just reducing it in the burn unit because presumably those animals are still kind of in the area. They're just somewhere else.
Well, I think it'll become evident here. Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think we're necessarily getting rid of them on the landscape, although they're probably in relatively low abundance across these landscapes because, when it is frequent burned at the landscape scale. But I think what we're actually seeing is they're being relegated to the bottom ones.
Yes.
In the system, and that'll be evident here in a few minutes because of another study.
Okay. Well, I hope I'm not like getting too far ahead, but one of the things that is interesting to me to think about in terms of this is that this is a very frequent fire landscape. Like in general, northern Florida, compared to a lot of other areas of the country, burns a lot.
Yeah.
And so imagine what the differences would be in these values for a landscape that is not burned as often and to the extent that northern Florida is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this area of the world is commonly touted as the fire capital of the world because we light so much for fire.
Right. So I think about like how drastic would this difference be in a place like, central Alabama that doesn't have, still has, a good bit of fire, but the whole landscape is not altered by fire the same way that northern Florida is.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Well, 250-yard radius, that's a pretty big area. A lot of people are managing their stands at that scale. You know what I mean? Like your whole fire unit. I don't know what the area of that is. And I do, we had a whole bunch of people rating our podcast after we talked about that recently. I think it's funny that we have multiple ratings that they took that opportunity to correct your math.
I like how you conveniently bring up my math errors and not yours. And the reason that I have more than you is because you're afraid to calculate things in your head on the air.
I agree. Well, we need to be precise.
We do.
So
We do, but it's one of those things. If you record anybody enough, they're going to make mistakes. So I'll own up to it. But
we are ecologists, not mathematicians. So
that's that's right. But I will freely admit that I was wrong in saying that it was 15 miles to the center of a 30 square mile block.
yeah,
It was one of those things that you're saying it in the moment, and it felt right before it started coming out of your mouth. But as soon as it did, you're like, this does not feel right. But it's too late now.
yeah. Well, I didn't even notice. So anyway, you can go calculate what that area is if you want to know. But anyway,
There we go.
that's a fairly big area, and to reduce the detection, I mean, with a 2-year interval down below 10% across the board, to me, that is pretty striking.
Yeah, so if you were looking at the efficacy of a trapping program to achieve that, you would be, I think, really satisfied.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So,
But you've not only reduced through your effort and through maybe the input costs that you had to pay for burning if you don't do it yourself, you've been potentially as effective as a trapping program while concurrently improving habitat quality for turkeys.
that's exactly where I was going to go with it. Not only did you probably achieve a similar or better outcome, one that we would be happy about, but you also increased the vegetation quality to meet all the other demands for nesting and brooding, particularly brooding,
Right.
because there's a million ways to die as a bolt. The thermal environment,
Right.
insect abundance, like we could just line all kinds of things up, all sorts of reasons to die. Including avian predators and snakes and things, that vegetation structure is probably helping with. But
Yeah.
anyway, they looked at what they called the neighborhood scale as well. And I found that's pretty striking too, because the 250 yard or 200 meter radius, like that's a pretty big size, but the neighborhood scale is a 750 meter, so whatever that equates to in area, that's a pretty big space. I mean, we're talking about.
I bet that's gotta be that. Oh man, you just called me out on my math mistakes, and now I'm hesitant.
trying to, yeah.
Well, I'm just thinking back to, we did that episode on feeding, and we found that net success was affected within, what was it, out to like 300,
I think it was
400 meters.
Yeah, and that was like
equated to like 50 acres.
Yeah. Yeah, something like that. Well, I didn't do the math like I should have beforehand, but anyway, they at the neighborhood scale, I mean, we can all agree, 750 meters, I mean, we are way outside of hearing range of a gobble, like we're 3 or 4 times the length of what you could hear one gobble from. Like, that's a huge scale.
Yeah.
So with, at that scale, if you're on a 2-year return interval, now these grids are in uplands, so we're on 2-year scale. The detection probability across the board is still less than 20% at that scale.
Wow.
Like, that's huge.
Yeah.
When I saw this, I just read it recently. In fact, I talked about this on one of the upcoming episodes. I don't think it's launched yet, but it will be soon, of Gamekeepers. And actually on that episode, they recorded it at the convention, and to my understanding, they had multiple researchers come on to talk about something specific, and they're kind of got an amalgam of those topics together in this episode. That's what I understand for Bobby.
Yeah.
I don't know what they'll look like when they fully cut it, but I know Brett Collier was on right before me talking about pigs as it related to nesting success from a lot of their studies, which has tons of nests all across the Southeast. So you
Right.
guys could go listen to that. I'm sure it's really interesting. In fact, I know some of it is because I was sitting there while he was going through it, waiting in line to be the next one. But anyway, because
Yeah.
one of the species they were detecting in this was feral hogs. So the hogs
Uh-huh.
went from 70% to less than 10% when you don't burn to when you're burning on a 2-year interval as well at the patch scale. And they were included at that neighborhood scale. So, I mean, to me, this Boone et al. Paper that we just covered, I mean, I, I'm pretty confident that if we reduce the occurrence of predators by that much, regardless of whatever else is going on, we're probably going to decrease predation risk on turkeys at the survival of adult, the nest success, and the poult rearing stage.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Like
I
all.
think in it. Yeah, I think and also an important point to make here is I know that there's currently still some conversation in the turkey world about how actively hens choose their nest site or whether they choose their nest site to try to maximize the probability that it won't be discovered by a predator and things like that. But so even if they're not, even if hens are not good at choosing sites that hide their nests from predators better, just the simple fact is burning is still beneficial.
Yeah.
Like even if burning is not necessarily creating better nesting conditions, which I would argue that we have a lot of data to say that it does, but some don't believe that. It would still stand to benefit turkeys.
Yeah. Well, I have some information on this. Chamberlain's group has published a couple of good resources I'm going to tie in here.
Okay.
Well, let's move on to the next one. So this one is Jones et al. 2004. The title is Prescribed Fire and Raccoon Use of Longleaf Pine Forest. Implications for Managing Nest Predation.
Oh.
So that study that I just covered, the Boone et al., I did not mention between the 5 study areas, they were in general sampling between January and July. So it was generally lined up with the nesting and brooding season. And when all the hen mortality occurs, pretty much because it's associated with those 2 life stages generally. But they did have one site that was only January and February. 4 of the 5 included March, and 3 of the 5 included March and April in the sampling. So, there were a little difference in sampling efforts as it relates to the actual vital rate that we're making inferences about. But in general, they do overlap with nesting and brooding. But this Jones et al. Paper, they actually radio tagged raccoons in this study, and they were specifically interested in how the behavior of the raccoon was affected by prescribed burns during ground nesting bird season. So think March, April, May, June, and maybe even July, because I think they're doing it in quail country. They probably were thinking about quail nesting as well. So in this study, they wanted to measure the effects of fire occurrence. So this wasn't about frequency. It was just about whether or not fire had occurred in the last year based on when they were sampling in a given stand. And they radio tagged a whole bunch of raccoons, 30 in the first year of the study, 27 in the second year of the study. And used that, the relocations of the animal to basically look at habitat use as it was affected by fire occurrence within the previous calendar year. So overall, I'll just go ahead and summarize this one because I think we've still got some ground to cover here, and I don't want this to be all day. They had, between the 2 years, close to 2,600 relocations over the 57 raccoons or so.
Yeah.
And overall, fire decreased the probability of use by raccoons. So fire has occurred, within the past year. The probability of raccoons using that stand based on these radio tag individuals was decreased by 62%. And in one of the
Oh my
years, it was
God.
80%.
I didn't expect it to be that strong. I mean, I would have really, expected it to be closer to something like 15, 20%, and I still would have thought that was, significant and worth pursuing from a turkey management perspective.
Yeah. No, it was pretty substantial. And I know Chamberlain, I guess it was when he was in graduate school, he did something like this in Mississippi
Yep.
and published it. And I haven't looked at that paper in a while, but I can remember him saying something like, it's basically a burned area is a hole in their home range when it's been burned.
Yeah. I remember that.
Yeah. And, I had a student, Don Chance, that was looking at this stuff, and we saw a similar thing when we were looking at burning and thinning and stuff. So, pretty strong effect. Raccoons are getting relegated to the bottomlands, and this next study I'm going to cover, I think, speaks to that directly because they measured distance to hardwoods, which in these pine systems is basically a drain.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean, still, again, pretty striking. Different kind of data collections, but it doesn't matter if you're using the camera grids to look at the community level or if you're tagging individual species like raccoons, pretty similar results. They're definitely avoiding it.
Yeah.
So this last paper focused on predators, I think is also really interesting. I actually have covered this with the authors on Fire University before.
Okay.
I don't remember what episode it was, but it was something about how prescribed fire affects the relative abundance of predators. The title's something like that.
Right.
So you can hear the authors talk about it in detail if folks want to go listen to that episode. But to summarize it here, they measured a whole bunch of things that were affecting the predator abundances across the landscape. So this was George et al. 2020, Fire and Land Cover Drive Abundances, Predator Abundances in a Pyric Landscape. So that's the title. And we'll link all of these, but it also makes it easy for Charlotte to find them whenever I read that off. So there you go, Charlotte. So this is clipped straight out of their paper. Coyote and bobcat increased in relative abundance with decreasing pyrodiversity. All right. So now I've talked about, I'm talking about this from various aspects. We talked about frequency in that first paper, then the time since fire occurred in the second paper, and now we're talking about diversifying your fire regime so that you have active fire in different places, but it's varying. So you might, we recommend all kinds of ways to do that all the time, from having variation in your fire return interval to making sure that you're not burning stands adjacent to one another at the same time. There's lots of ways to do this, but they tried to measure that in this. But those two, the coyote and bobcat, obviously big time hen predators, increased in relative abundance as you decreased pyrodiversity. But also the same was true for the number of unique time since fire values. So basically, if you think about it this way, if you take an area and you make sure that you're not burning the ones in that area at the same time, so you have, they're all in the fire return interval, but you have stands adjacent to one another. Let's say if you're 3-year fire return interval, you make sure your block of stands are representing 0, 1, and 2 years since fire at any given time, and they kind of rotate through that.
Yeah.
That's kind of what they're measuring here.
Right.
So they used camera trapping in this study as well. This was also in North Florida, and it was an open pine, frequent fire landscape for the most part. So the raccoon relative abundance increased with distance from recent burns. So the farther you get, it wasn't even just they don't use the recent burn. Their probability of use increased as you get farther from it, which is kind of interesting. Another thing that they wrote was that coyote and bobcat relative abundance increased as you got closer to hardwoods. So that's where I think it speaks to what we said earlier. The distance to hardwoods is an important player here. And overall, for each of the predators, the most important things seem to be pretty consistently some combination of distance to hardwood, pyrodiversity, fire return interval, and distance to recent burns.
Yeah.
So definitely playing a huge role in how abundant and how frequently predators use these stands.
Yeah. So there's really two things.
I don't know if you can hear me, but hold your thought because you're breaking up. Hey, you got me?
Hey, you got me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jinx.
Sorry about that. Verizon this must be anti-turkey because I was just having a revelation when we cut out. But yeah, there were two things that stood out to me. One may seem a little bit nuanced. Some hunters and land managers might think, I don't care why hens nest where they do. I just want them to be more successful. But 9 times out of 10, if you ask me, why does birding potentially affect nesting success? I would say that it's because of the enhanced, hiding cover for the hen in her nest, right? Agree?
Yeah. I generally think about it that way.
These data make me wonder, well, maybe that is true, but maybe it's also true that they're selecting to nest in these bird areas because predator abundance is lower there.
I think that is an equal likelihood. I think one thing about that is it isn't necessarily that all predators are less abundant. Like some of the aerial predators, for example, they might be more common in that landscape.
Yes, I would agree with
that. I generally think you're right that it's probably decreasing predation risk, at least from the mammal predator community.
Yeah.
But we also exclusively focus on that yield when we're trapping. So,
yeah,
there's that to think about.
Well, the other thing is that guild is very important too because they represent the greatest risk to the hen.
Right.
Not just her eggs, but her.
Yes. Right. The snakes aren't going in and eating the hen. Right. So them coming in and stealing a few eggs is relatively inconsequential compared to, to a coyote eating the hen.
Right. But the other thing that stood out to me, relative to especially like the coyote results that you just reported, was that absolutely jives with some of the work that I did for my PhD, or right after my PhD rather, relative to the role that habitat plays in influencing fawn predation.
Yeah.
And what we generally found is that fawn predation was generally lowest for the fawns that had the greatest cover type diversity within their home range.
Yeah.
And that sounds very similar to what you just described with the burn patch diversity.
Yes, I agree. I mean, pyrodiversity basically means that you're generating a diversity of vegetation conditions within a given space with fire.
Right.
So I do think that they're parallel. So,
but bigger picture, go ahead.
Well, I have a couple of other papers of interest because I wanted to see, does it actually translate to a change in the vital rate? Like, do we have the data on that?
Yeah.
For turkeys. So in short, we don't. we have the data, but it's not done in a way that we can confirm. Like it's not. We don't have very much comparing nesting success with and without fire, like in a experiment that was designed specifically to do that at the population levels. But there are a bunch of studies that are relevant. Chamberlain's group I mentioned earlier has a really good couple of, well, probably several papers, but only a couple that are looking at nesting. But he led a paper with James Martin and Gregory Wan, which I think was a student or a postdoc at the time. But it was a review of how prescribed fire affects wild turkeys in the southeast. So we'll link that. I'll probably do something on this eventually, maybe in concert with this episode even, like a research update thing. But it was published in 2017. And it goes through a bunch of the literature we have. But one of their other papers spoke directly to this, and that was Nathan Yeldale, which was a student previously in Mike Chamberlain's lab, and it was published in 2017 as well. And so they wrote, at the local scale, turkeys nested in areas with high or higher percent ground cover vegetation, so that's what they were selecting. At the landscape scale, turkeys nested closer to roads and farther from edges of two plant communities. Turkeys selected to nest in forest stands burned 2 years prior. Specifically, they nested in places that were burned 2 years ago exactly.
Yeah.
Nest survival, let's see. They didn't find a relationship with that, but oh, here we go. Turkey nests in stands burned greater than or equal to 3 years prior had lower survival than nests in stands burned the current year. That's the only relationship they found.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, they had another statement. Let me look and see if I can find it again. Turkeys in our study area had a longer reproductive season and higher nesting and re-nesting rates relative to other populations in the southeastern United States.
Huh.
That's the sentence I was trying to find. So this study, they acknowledged when they compared it to other studies across the southeast that their nesting and re-nesting rates were higher than what others were reporting.
Okay.
So,
and it was in a very fire-maintained landscape.
Yeah, I mean, the title of the paper is Nest Site Selection and Nest Survival of Eastern Wild Turkeys in a Pyric Landscape.
Right.
So, we covered when you guys could go back and listen to the episode with Chris Moorman that we had. We covered the study that I was a part of. I wasn't the grad student leading it at the time, but I helped with some of the capture and data collection and published some other stuff related to that work. But in that study, the nesting success was very high as well, and that was another landscape that was mostly open pine with frequent fire, 3-year return interval. So I think there's probably room to go out and find that data where we could put together a whole bunch of studies and do a meta-analysis to get it, but just anecdotally from several studies that we have, I think it's pretty consistent that when turkeys are in a landscape with high sunlight penetration and frequent fire, the vital rates tend to be high. Or nesting success, at least. I don't know that we have that data on any other life stage.
Well, Yeah, and I think what's really interesting about this, and to kind of bring it all together, um, and this is something that we have said on the show before, but now we're offering confirmatory evidence of, is that potentially the landscape of the southeast, which is over time, you know, burned at a smaller scale, less frequently than it used to be, is becoming more conducive or habitable, right, by predators, while at the
Yes.
same time, turkey habitat quality is declining because fire not only provides better nesting cover and potentially reduced predator abundance from these studies that we've just gone over, but it also increases the percent cover throughout the landscape of plants that are beneficial to turkeys from a foraging and a cover perspective.
Yes. So, to which I would respond, what do you expect to happen?
Yeah, well, exactly. But in spite of that, it's not that uncommon to still talk to folks that are skeptical about that recommendation.
I know. And to, you just laid it out really clearly. The landscape, we have less fire on the landscape. We have less of these open stands with frequent fire that are promoting all that structure. Not only is that decreasing habitat quality for turkeys during nesting and brooding, which are the critical time periods for obviously nesting and brooding, but also hen survival, which
Right.
are usually lost because of predation, but the commensurate changes in vegetation also lead to predators not being relegated to the bottomland areas and expanding up into those areas so that they're detected much more frequently. Like
Yeah.
and then how do you solve that? Like, that's the thing that I get to. Like, to me, that doesn't scream that we need to increase trapping. That is a
Yeah.
habitat problem,
Yeah.
clearly. Now, can
Yeah.
habitat and trapping be used in concert to be more effective? Absolutely. But that's why I kind of always shade on that side, because what we're seeing on the landscape is very clearly a habitat issue that leads to
Right.
this perfect storm that we should expect to decrease all of the vital rates, principally by an increased loss to predation.
Right.
And forgive me if I don't jump to the conclusion that we should immediately trap to fix that when it's a habitat problem that caused it.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think trapping is a valuable tool, but that's, we're really getting to the nuts and bolts of the argument there. I don't think that increased predator abundance is the cause of this issue. However, increased predator abundance might be a consequence of the habitat problem.
Yeah. Well, I'll get on my soapbox a little bit here, I guess, which I know you like it when I do that.
Well, I just
But
stepped off of it, so here you go.
well, there's one more. I noticed that you were on yours for a minute. That's what inspired me. I think but we can't have an episode where we don't talk about feeding at least a little bit, right? we've hit we've hit almost
Yeah,
all.
well, go ahead. I don't want to steal your thunder because you almost got me back up on the soapbox.
Well, I appreciate that because you probably would have said exactly what I'm about to say, which is that by reducing the scale and frequency of fire across the landscape, we're making habitat conditions worse for turkeys, better for predators, and then you're layering feeding and baiting on top of that, and you're supplementing those predator populations that have moved into areas that shouldn't even be habitable by them in the first place.
That that is absolutely almost certainty. I mean, it like the other way I was going to put it a little differently. Feeding probably negates all of this stuff to some degree as well. Like, if you go and
Oh, that's
feed in the
true.
middle of a burned area, the raccoons are probably going to use it at much higher rates then. You don't get the same habitat effects out of it because of that supplement, I would guess. I don't have data
That makes
to speak to that, but that's kind of a different way of
Yeah,
saying a similar thing.
I don't know what would drive, raccoons to not use areas that don't really receive much fire, or I mean, to use areas that don't receive much fire and not use areas that do. But I would presume that it has to do with some kind of change in resource availability within that area when it's burned versus burned.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about this from a perspective of a land manager, right? And so let's say I'm using prescribed fire as a tool to improve habitat conditions for turkeys. And at the same time, we've got better nesting cover, we've got better, foraging availability for not only the hen, but then also her eventual brood once they hatch. And then we've also potentially reduced predator use of that area by burning it, just talked about today.
Yeah.
Presumably, that decrease in predator use is associated to a resource limitation that occurs after burning. Maybe it's something, I don't really know what it is. Maybe it's just food availability. But then when we reintroduce feed or bait back up into those areas that have been burned, we're thus re-incentivizing the predator to return to that area and at least partially undermining some of our work.
I think that's exactly what you're doing. So here we are back.
Folks, you can tell, Marcus has me trained really well to try to relate everything back to feeding.
Yeah. Well, I just think it is a front and center issue. Like, it's hard to stay away from it now.
It is.
So, but I mean, the overall take home point is we have several studies that clearly demonstrate open forest conditions with fire cause a significant decline in the preference for an area by predators and a decrease, therefore, in their occurrence for, in terms of how much they would detect turkeys, whether they're walking around or nesting or whatever, pretty much across the board for mammalian predators.
Right.
Which, to me, screams that habitat is an anti-predator strategy that's really effective.
Right.
And it also accomplishes all the other things for turkeys by enhancing their success, by providing insects and cover and, from the elements and all those things too. And
right.
Many of the studies from across the Southeast seem to indicate that when we measure a vital rate like nesting in those burned landscapes, they tend to be higher than when we measure those same things in landscapes that are not.
Yeah.
So, I'm pretty sure, I can't remember the exact vital rate number that Chris Moorman gave, but that was, what was it, episode 19. If folks want to go back and listen to it, you can scroll back down. It's called Burning During Nesting, which is another contentious issue, right? So you may need to use some of that burn window to get this done on your property. And in that landscape, we had one nest, I think, that interacted with fire. It was 3% overall of the ones we were tracking.
Yeah.
And the nesting success in that study was really high.
Right. Yeah, so, that's another aspect of this that we really haven't even gotten into, but I talked just a minute ago how it might be counterintuitive that, hens are not just selecting to nest in areas that hide them well, but also those may be areas that have lower predator abundance. And then the one third point that I was going to add on to that is that, hens choose to do what they do, or wildlife in general. And when I say choose, please realize that I'm not saying that this is something that they're sitting there debating the pros and cons of in their mind. This is something that is probably deeply hardwired into their system because, they're the recipients of genetics of a long lineage.
Yeah. They're responding to cues.
Exactly. They're the results of a successful lineage of hens that chose to nest in areas that maximize their fitness, right? Their success, passing their genes on to subsequent generations. And so they might be choosing to nest there not only because it's better concealment cover for them, not only because predator abundance is lower there, but also a potential third point is that we see way fewer, because you just mentioned burning during the nesting season, right? We see way fewer nests that are actually consumed by fire than you would expect due to random chance, even when these units that have nests in them are burned. So maybe hens are not only just selecting for areas that have lower predator abundance, but maybe they're also selecting for areas that have, within a fire maintained landscape, they're selecting a nest in vegetation that might have a lower likelihood of catching fire, even if the unit is burned.
I think that is happening. I mean, I have some anecdotes from Fort Bragg where the Kilberg et al. Study was done, where I did my graduate work, and also know we have several listeners for there. So shout out to you guys that are at Bragg. We had multiple instances where a hen had nested in a stand that then got burned, and the nest was not lost to burning. And I did just look at this paper, and we'll append this, and then go listen to Chris Moorman. I think that episode on burning during nesting, because that's such a contentious issue, man, he really kind of put that to bed. But for exactly what you're saying, like, even in these landscapes where we're doing a lot of burning and even focusing burning, and it's even at large scales, we still we don't influence hardly any nests. And I'm sorry, but I'd rather sacrifice. I mean, it's never this much, but even if it was 10%, if that decreased predation on nests by 50%, that would be a really good trade-off.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know if that's Absolutely. What the effect sizes are, but what I do know is when we look at these studies, like Chris Moorman's, the one that he led with Eric Kilberg as the lead author, like, the nesting success was very high, even though a large portion of the burning was during nesting.
Yeah.
So I just read in the discussion, predation was still the primary cause, but it was only 53% of the losses were due to predation this time, which is lower than usual.
Yeah, it is lower than usual for sure.
Yeah, and I think I saw somewhere where it did say there was only one nest lost. Yep, here we go. One nest destroyed by fire in our study failed in June, near the end of nesting season, and the female did not re-nest as a result.
Yeah. I mean, that was probably a doomed nest anyway if she was nesting in June.
Yeah. In this study, 20% of the study area was burned annually during the wild turkey nesting season.
Right.
Like, that's, 20% of the available area is being burned in that study area only within the bounds of when we would expect nesting to be happening, and we've got one out of all the nests.
Right. Yeah. So one other point that I wanted to make about this too, because I feel like there is a little bit of confusion out there about it, where some folks think that, maybe hens aren't actively selecting where they nest based off of some of the data that has been collected. But the thing that I think is important for us to keep in mind is there are all sorts of reasons that hens probably choose to nest in a specific location, and concealment cover from predators is only one of those possible considerations, right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
There's all these things related to potential, avoiding getting her nest burned up and choosing an area that has lower predator abundance that we have not been factoring into nest site selection analyses. And maybe we should start doing that for those reasons.
Yeah, I think there are some folks that are doing some similar things where they're getting an index of predator abundance, for example. So there's some work going on, and we will be covering it, I'm sure, as soon as it's available. But you're right. But the other thing I was thinking about, I mean, I've looked at a whole bunch of nesting studies, and we've covered a bunch of them. And there's been nest site selection when anytime fire is present on the landscape or early
Right.
succession. That shrubby early succession, like Craig and them showed us in that video.
Yep.
We can post that.
Yep.
Charlotte, link that video again if folks want to look at that. It's a great visual of what hens selected in the Tennessee study, and they showed a whole bunch
they
of
actually
different
went to the
situations.
nest sites.
Yeah, they went to the actual nest sites to show you a visual of what that looked like. But I mean, that was the strongest nest site selection in that study I've ever seen. The same thing, the Kilberg study, strong nest site selection. They were putting the majority of their nest in a very low proportion of the landscape in terms of vegetation availability. The Yeldale paper that I just mentioned a few minutes ago, they were selecting burned areas. So I wonder if we don't see strong nest site selection in circumstances where there's not access to stands that are being managed for good nesting cover.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so maybe, well, I mean, at the risk of overstating this, maybe fire is such an important consideration in the hen selection process that when she's on a landscape that's not burned, it's hard to even detect any kind of selection.
Yeah, I mean, if she has very distinct cues that are promoted by fire that invoke the strong nest site selection response, well, when she's in the absence of those cues, maybe she doesn't have a strong indicator of what to choose. I don't know. I think that's definitely something to explore, but my point is, to me, there's more than a dozen studies at least that show really strong nest site selection for things right around the nest and at a larger spatial scale too.
Yeah, I mean, generally, any site that has a significant amount of prescribed fire going on, they're going to show that hens like to nest in areas that were burned 2 or 3 years prior.
Yeah. Yep.
That was a good one, man.
I know, I like when they get us both up on our high horse for a minute.
Well, that was, it's just like, how can you not help but get excited when information like that comes out that you can tie into other things that we've already been talking about being important? And it just like weaves this entire story together and gives you a little bit of insight into the bigger picture instead of just the individual puzzle pieces.
Yeah. Well, and that, the thing is that the folks that wrote that paper, I guess the lead author now is in the turkey world, because he's a postdoc now working on turkeys. But before that, none of those people really focus on turkeys for that first study I covered.
Yeah.
They were just looking at how fire affects mammals.
Right.
So I also like it, I guess, when we get some expertise that's not necessarily in the turkey controversy, we'll call it, trying to figure out what's going on with turkeys, and then they produce something like this, and it's like, man, that has powerful implications for turkeys.
Yeah,
like they're not even in the discussion, and they're still producing information that I think is pretty critical to this whole discussion about turkeys.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that is an exciting thing too, to just think about how many answers that we already have that are out there in the published literature if we just, take the time to find it. Or a lot of times what it takes to get to this point is have a conversation that sparks the idea that leads to you finding it. I think that's what happened with you.
Yep. That's exactly it. Yeah, this, I am generally tracking to the best of my ability anything that has turkeys related in the paper. Like I'm tracking them as they come out. Anything about prescribed fire. And then I usually track stuff related to deer and quail as well. So those topics often overlap a lot, but not always. But this one,
Right.
because I was tracking fire, and I just, I try to at least read the abstract on every paper that comes up. I set up a Google Scholar alert with keywords based on these different things.
Right.
And essentially what that does is the Google Scholar alert sends me an alert every time something is published that has the keywords in it. And it does it weekly.
Right.
So I just got this one recently from my keywords related to prescribed fire, and I did not get it in the turkey related keywords. But,
Right.
I'm doing that, and now I'm looking at things like this and say, oh, that, that's related to turkeys. So I'm trying to bring it in whenever I can. And you're right. There's so many people doing really awesome work out there. And if we just are looking, we can bring it in to gain from that for the turkey conversation.
Right.
Well, I think, I think we've strengthened this point.
I think we have
Solid habitat management is an anti-predator management strategy.
no doubt.
I mean, I think it's hard to argue against that.
Yeah, and I mean, you think about implementing prescribed fire based off of the evidence that we've discussed today at the landscape scale. And by that, I mean, let's get more fire back into the landscape. Let's burn more frequently where we already do if it's not being burned adequately, right?
Yep.
And what all that could potentially add up to over time is not only are you potentially helping move the predator, so to speak, out of our areas where hens are wanting to nest or prefer to nest, but long term, you're almost even, decreasing the carrying capacity of the area to support those predators. We haven't even talked about that. Like everything that we discussed so far today was just a behavioral exclusion, right, from those areas.
Mm-hmm.
But you would expect if those conditions continue over time, and just as we talked about in the Florida Panhandle, which is a very pyrogenic landscape, you may have lower overall predator abundance there because there's not as much area that is suitable for their occupancy.
Right. Well, you either, well, it could be either or both. You're either through behavioral avoidance decreasing the effective density, or you're actually just decreasing density. And either way, it's good for turkeys.
Well, what I would hope is that it would be both, in the sense that, maybe you're cutting the population of those nest predators down by taking areas that were formerly usable to them off the map. And then at the same time, they don't want to go into the areas where your hen is nesting. I really hope that that's the way it works. And it's hard not to imagine that it isn't, because I see all these properties that implement these practices that have strong turkey populations.
Yes. Hey, I just had a gem of an idea when you were going through that.
Okay.
We're talking about, with the raccoon example, it was a beautiful example. We decreased, in that study from Canada, they decreased raccoon abundance through trapping by 90%, right? And then those 10% responded through compensatory reproduction. That is a density effect. So in these fire maintained landscapes, even if you're causing behavioral avoidance of the uplands so that you're increasing density in the lowlands, that should suppress, through density mediated factors, reproduction of that predator community. So you should be accomplishing both based on the principles of how these populations are working. Because you're concentrating the animals down into a smaller amount of space, increasing the effective density, they should be a commensurate decrease in productivity because of that.
Right. Good point.
It's good
Really good
stuff.
point.
Maybe getting a little too sciencey, but
Nah,
essentially
it's
what
in the
we're
name.
saying,
It's in the name.
yeah, if we're saying, what we're saying is that if you're burning a lot of the area and causing the predators to avoid that, then they are by default concentrated in a smaller amount of the area that's not burned, and therefore should have higher competition for the more limited resources and therefore reproduce less. Now, I don't have that data, but that's how populations generally work with density mediated things like reproduction.
Right. Do you mind if I go out on a limb for a second?
I think last time you asked me that, I said, what species of limb? So is this a flimsy limb or strong limb? Yeah, go ahead.
I'll say it. I'll say it. Then I'll let you be the judge.
Go
I'm
for it.
starting to think that fire is good for turkeys.
I don't think you went out a limb. I think you went out on a big old log.
I'm starting to think that fire might be good for turkeys, Marcus.
I mean, well, I think, you and I have both been screaming this from the rafters for, our whole career.
Yeah.
And to me, today's episode should resonate with a lot of the people that haven't quite yet been convinced.
Right.
So, folks out there, I know you've got either you are that person or you've got buddies and friends and family who are thinking this is all about predators. And if you have those people, share this episode with them.
Right.
Because what we're the habitat folks, like we usually get lumped in with, are promoting decreasing predators through habitat.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. It's just this
Right.
approach would also improve all of the other things that are associated with the turkey vital rates.
Yeah, and if this is something that you're really interested in, or the person that you tell wants more information on, I can't remember the exact episode it was, Marcus, but maybe it was like 2 to 3 weeks ago. We also did an episode, and we made the point that a high rate of nest loss to predators, especially, it could be indicative of both a habitat issue and a predation issue, because they would manifest themselves the same way, right? And this
right.
episode, I feel like, makes that more clear, is that you're going to have higher incidence of predation in areas where habitat quality, whether that, especially as it pertains to burning for today's discussion, if habitat quality is poor because you're not burning, you're going to have higher rates of nest loss because predators are going to be using those areas.
That's right.
But that's not.
And
trapping wouldn't necessarily solve that, because if you don't reintroduce fire, it's just going to keep happening again and again.
Yeah, so it's a symptom of the problem in that case, and you're treating the symptom instead of the cause. So yeah,
Sure.
I think that was episode 64 where we really laid out that argument, but it could have been 63 and 64. We were talking about those very things.
Right.
So yeah, good stuff, man. I hope this one goes viral, because this, if we can get people to widespread understand this and adopt these things, we're potentially talking about substantial increases on turkey productivity across the landscape.
Yeah. Well, I love turkeys so much, obviously, or I wouldn't be a part of this, wouldn't have chosen my career path. But the other thing that excites me about this too is that we've just made the best case, I think, that we ever have since we launched this show for burning for turkeys. And we know that there's so many other both game and non-game species out there across the landscape that are going to benefit from this as well.
Yes.
So I just look at it as wins all the way around.
I agree. I mean, basically, go look at the species of conservation concern in uplands in the eastern United States, and all of them just about are fire influence or fire dependent.
Right.
Positively.
There you go.
So, yep, I agree.
That was good, man. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. I hope the audio quality didn't detract from folks. I guess if so, we can re-record it. I'm sure we'll be all in the middle of this discussion in many episodes to come as well.
Absolutely.
All right. I know you gotta.
All right.
You gotta get going. You probably need to get gas by now. So, thanks for calling in.
Close, but I'm getting close for sure. But yeah, I mean it's Turkey Tour 24, right? Not the Turkey Tour most people think of. Most people think of that pertaining to hunting, and we're hopefully going to do a little bit of that this spring too. But
well, our turkey tour is
it's
really about making turkeys, because we're going to do.
it is about making turkeys, but yeah, if there's one thing that I'm okay with being, on the road so much and away from the family so much more, it's this. So
Yeah, I agree. All right, well, I'll let you go, and thanks everybody out there for listening. Really appreciate all the support. It's been just exceptional. Thanks for everybody that was at the convention, stopped by to say hello. Can't thank you enough for all the support, and it's really motivating us to keep up the grind.
yes, it is. Thank y'all.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.